And welcome, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful Apologetics Dojo Radio. And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Dr. Robert Delfino about Aquinas' third way, and we're talking about two basic ways of being. There is possible being, there is necessary being, and Dr. Delfino, you did an outstanding job talking about possible being, really boiling it down to some very simple concepts. And I love that example you give about the keys being locked in the car, because you're right. You end up with this impossible circularity that you can't open the car door without the keys, and the keys are inside. So it's like, okay, so, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, I suppose?
So
yeah, I forgot about the OnStar twist. That's interesting.
So we're ready to move to the next stage, but let me just do a teeny little summary at this point. So previously we were talking about a thought experiment. Could everything that exists in the universe be a possible being? In other words, there are no necessary beings. And we realized that that's impossible, right? We imagine a world where there's just one possible being, but this is a problem because a possible being is always dependent on a cause outside of it. And in a world with only one thing, there is no cause outside of it. We realize that nothingness can't cause anything because nothingness has no power to cause anything. We realize that this one possible being can't cause itself because that would be contradictory. And we realize that if we add another possible being, that there's that vicious circularity with like the keys in the car and locked and all that. So the conclusion of all that is we can have a world with only possible beings, which means there must be at least one necessary being that exists in order to explain the things around us that we see, because we know things exist. I mean, you and I are here talking where we exist, right?
Yeah, right. I hope so. But that's another thought experiment.
Yeah, I had a friend who doubted he existed for a few years. I don't know how that's possible. Maybe he's a better philosopher than I am. Probably is. So now we can move to the next stage. And actually, this is where it starts to get fun, because the early stages are like preparatory, but
right.
So we know that there has to be at least one necessary being. But guess what? There are two kinds of necessary beings. The first kind are necessary through itself, and the second kind are necessary through another. Now, this can get pretty tedious and crazy philosophical, but I have a nice example for it. Think of the sun. Every day we wake up, and if we go outside and it's not cloudy, we see the beautiful sun, which gives us light. And without it, there wouldn't be life on this planet. Well, let's do another thought experiment, right? Imagine that the sun always existed and the sun will always exist. In this thought experiment, right, the sun would be a necessary being. Now, light is always coming out of the sun. So if the sun always existed, and it always will exist, well, if light's always coming out of it, the light always existed, and the light will always exist. But notice the difference. The light is still dependent on the sun to exist. If you could somehow destroy the sun, then the light would no longer exist. So the light is necessary, but necessary through another, the sun. The sun, however, in this example, is necessary through itself. So any questions on that distinction?
No, I like that. Yeah, so as long as you have whenever you have the sun, you have light, necessarily. But but the light is only through the sun. So if you don't have a sun, light doesn't exist. So yeah,
right. There's a kind of dependency, right? The light is still dependent on the sun. So now we go to another thought experiment. And there's a lot of thought experiments today because the funding in philosophy is very poor. So can it be that the only kind of necessary beings that exist are necessary through another? And we realize the answer here is no, too. Because, it's similar to our earlier reasoning. When something is necessary through another, well, that something is dependent on something else. And so if A is dependent on B, and B is also necessary through another, well, then B is dependent on C. But if C is also necessary through another, then C is dependent on D. Now, this is not going to work unless there's something that's necessary in itself. Because only something that's necessary in itself can give necessity to others. Now, does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, that's very good. So I guess to use an analogy, if we were like in a dark room with a single window and a shaft of light hits a mirror, and that mirror reflects the light, hits another mirror, so that would be dependent. But if you cut off the light and you just have mirrors facing each other, like you wouldn't have light.
That's a great example. I may have to use that in class, Gary. Very good. Yeah, those mirrors are intermediary causes. They are just receiving the light and then passing it on. But if there's no light to receive, then, like you said, you wouldn't have any light in the room. It'd be dark, right?
Okay. Yeah, good. Hey, that's
very good.
Chalk one up for the host.
Definitely. So what Aquinas basically argues in a nutshell, and I'm not going to belabor the point. I think we've made it, and your mirror example is excellent. Is that there has to be at least one being that has necessary existence through itself. In other words, it's not dependent on anything to get this necessary being. Yeah. And so that's an important conclusion. Now, in a way, that's sort of the final conclusion that Aquinas reaches in the third way, that there has to be a being that's necessary through itself.